Hello, Austin Petersen, Minarchist, wrote an article going around, you probably know of it, called Five Reasons Why I'm Not an Anarchist. Larkin Rose did a rebuttal. I did not watch it yet because I don't want to be influenced by him in his critique, but I thought I would offer my own critique. So I'm going to read what Austin Petersen wrote about why he's not an anarchist and criticize that because I think he is wrong. Okay, let's start from the beginning. Hold on one second. Five reasons why I'm not an anarchist, beginning now. So, the first thing he says is, read it. Let me just point out that one of the things he said was that I used to be an anarcho-capitalist, but now I'm not. And I'm very wary of people who say they used to be something. Of course, it's possible to change your mind. If anyone goes to Salon, however you pronounced it, website, there's a lot of things written by people who say, I used to be a libertarian, but now I am a progressive. And they give all these answers why they're no longer libertarian. But when you hear them, it's clear that they were never a libertarian because they're giving very superficial answers among someone who just doesn't know anything about libertarian and is just making assumptions or just heard about it. I mean, for someone who claims to be something to give very superficial reasons why not to be it, one should be skeptical. I think people often say, well, I am this, I used to be this, as a way to show, oh, I am better than that now. I used to be a libertarian, but I saw the light, and now I'm progressive. I used to be an anarcho-capitalist, but now I'm not. I sincerely doubt that Austin Petersen was an anarcho-capitalist. So right away, he's being intellectually dishonest. He's lying. Just say, this is why I think minarchism is correct and anarchy is wrong, instead of pretending that you used to be one. It's like Obama when he said, oh, I used to believe in Ayn Rand when I was in high school. Bullshit. You probably never read anything she ever wrote. You just judged a book by its title and criticize her because other people in your little bubble and circle were as well. So you're not fooling anyone. We're not an idiot. We don't believe you. You were never let me start. First reason why I'm not an anarchist. Number one, rights are guarantees. A right is something that must be provided. Okay, he's wrong right off the bat. A right is not something that anyone provides you. A right is not something that anyone gives you. A right is a negative right. A right is something that someone cannot do to you. You have a right not to be murdered. That's not providing you with anything. That's allowing you to live your life and not stopping you from doing something. And it's funny that Austin Petersen says this. So Austin Petersen was on a show hosted by Thomas Hartman where he said you are confusing positive and negative rights. A positive right is a grant that is determined based on someone else giving you something. But if rights are universal and everyone has the same rights, how can one person give you a right? If you're all equal and you can't give him the right, then how can he give you the right? And if someone can give you a right, they're not rights, they're privileges. So a right is simply you have certain rights, and these rights are to refrain from violating a person or their property. It's not a guarantee of anything. And simply having a right doesn't mean you'll be protected. Government says you have a right to free speech, but under the Espionage Act, under Woodrow Wilson, if you spoke out against World War I, you were thrown in jail. You can be held in contempt of court, which means simply speaking and saying something the judge doesn't like. You can be thrown in jail for that. A guy from Fiji was thrown in jail for 180 days for handing out pamphlets, giving it to juries, telling them what their rights as a jury are. And he was thrown in jail. So having a right is not a guarantee. And even if you say, well, I have a right to have people not violate my rights, that will be the case. Even having a government doesn't guarantee that government, one, will not turn aggressive and refrain from respecting your rights, And two, government doesn't always protect you. People have called the police and they've never shown up, or they've called the police and they've gotten killed. So simply having a right is not a guarantee. It's simply that you have something because you're a human being, and the right is the right to be secure in your person and property. But there's no guarantee that other people necessarily respect those rights. So he's wrong in his definition of rights. Any society, to continue, any society aimed at protecting natural rights must use some type of force to guarantee those rights. I agree. Any mechanism of force used to guarantee those rights have the same effect as government, no matter what the form may take. Well, this is terrible logic. So he's basically saying here, a government protects your rights, acting like a government, by using force to prevent other people from aggressing against you, and therefore you are ipso facto a state. Well, let's say a government produces food, or builds public schools, or roads. If a private school decides, if someone says, I want to have private school instead of public schools, it's true that they're acting the same as the government in the sense that they are building schools just like the government did, but they're not a government because they're subject to profit and loss. They're subject to competition. There's no guaranteed income through a compulsory levy known as taxation. So simply because government does something, just because you do some act in the same way or provide the same service government provides, doesn't mean that you are a government. I have heard Austin Petersen speak a few times, and I know he criticized the FDA. He doesn't want the FDA to exist, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't want people to test drugs to make sure they're safe. He wants there to be private consumer reports testing drugs. Well, any mechanism of testing drugs, in fact, let me reread the sentence and replace the use of force with testing drugs to see his fallacy. Any mechanism of testing drugs used to guarantee those drugs are being protected has the same effect as government, no matter what the form may take. See the fallacy? And why would Austin Petersen say we should abolish the FDA and have consumer reports? Well, a few reasons. One, the FDA is very susceptible to bribery. They don't have to worry about going out of business. It's not like if they're caught being bribed, there's another FDA to replace them. They're the only one in town. If you don't like how the FDA works, tough shit. And therefore, they're more susceptible to bribery. Private consumer reports that took bribery, people would say they can't be trusted, and therefore they would go out of business. Because the FDA is not subject to competition, they don't have to be efficient and when it comes to testing drugs. They can take their time. They can be very slow. It can be a long, arduous process. Whereas if you have private consumer reports that's more efficient at testing drugs than you will reap more profit, and therefore a consumer reports that's less efficient will go out of business. So there are different incentives in place. It's not just about, well, why does it matter who does it? Whether government uses force, whether a private agency uses force, why does it matter? Well, why does it matter that government produces food? Why does it matter that government should produce schools instead? Because there are different incentives when you have profit and loss and competition than when you have the state. Okay, if there is a natural right to a lawyer if you are accused of a crime, well, there's not a natural right to a lawyer if you are accused of a crime. Then that right means that there must be resources expanded to provide citizens with the defense against the government's accusation. Okay, so what he's basically saying so far, and he's wrong, is that if you're accused of a crime, you have the right to a lawyer. Well, one, this is not always true. In civil asset forfeiture, you don't have a right to a lawyer. When it comes to antitrust, you don't have a right to a lawyer. So only certain crimes you have a right to a lawyer. Murder, theft, and stuff like that. But if you're charged with being a monopoly, you have to prove that you're innocent. They don't have to prove that you're guilty, and you don't have a right to a lawyer. In civil asset forfeiture, the object is considered guilty of committing the crime and not the person, and therefore you have to provide your own lawyer your property back, which is precisely why around 80% of civil asset forfeiture cases go uncontested, because they can't afford to hire a lawyer. So there's not a natural right to a lawyer if you're accused of a crime, only certain crimes. Okay, so he's wrong again. A fully privatized justice system, a fully privatized law system would be justice for sale to the highest bidder. I guess he's never heard of Ethan Couch, who killed 4 people, and he got off for having affluenza. A government court said, you're rich, you never learned responsibility because you were rich, and you got off. So that seems to me sale for the highest bidder. If he's going to, it's not enough to basically say there are these flaws that I envision, therefore you need a state. What you have to do is, to make your argument, is saying this is why government would do it better. This is why there would be fewer flaws. There's no perfection. So he's not pointing an example that a law is not for sale for the highest bidder. If you look at the number of people in jail, is it mostly rich people in jail or mostly poor people in jail? And plus, there's David Frost has a great quote who said, a jury is composed of 12 men to see who has the better lawyer. Or a better lawyer, and therefore end up getting off, like O.J. Simpson, if you have a worse lawyer. So in a fully privatized law system, it's true, if you don't have a lot of money, you might not be able to get a great lawyer, and in turn, you might not get off for the crime, but there's no difference now. If you get a lawyer from the state, he's not going to be of caliber than if you hired your own. So that is not a unique to the market. Under a government, the same things exist as well. Citizens without the means to defend themselves would be railroaded into arbitration that works against their interests for whoever paid for the judge. So he doesn't understand how private law works. Okay, Bruce Benson wrote a great book called The Enterprise of Law, where he gave historical examples of how arbitration used to work among commercial law and merchant law, and winner paid all. It wasn't 50-50. If I accuse you of theft, no one gets paid until the end. And if it's determined you have to pay for my lawyer fees. And if it turns out that you're not guilty of theft, I don't have to pay anything. And one of the reasons that this exists is if winner pays all, they have a very strong incentive to not just countersue and do bad and fraudulent claims, because they know based on what the arbitration reaches that they'll be screwed in the end. You can't afford a lawyer to defend yourself under a private law system. One, the lawyer will not get paid until after the verdict is reached, and only the guilty party would pay. And if the guilty party is a poor person, well, you shouldn't commit a crime. And if the guilty party is the rich person, you don't have to worry about paying the lawyer, because the person who injured you pays not just what for you, but they also have to pay all the resources you need to get back how they violated your rights. So if someone steals $1,000 from you and you say, give me $1,000, and the person says, you don't like it, take me to court, well, they're saddled with the court fee, not you, because if they wouldn't have stolen, you wouldn't have to go to court. And if they would have agreed to fork over the money without saying, no, if you don't like it, sue me, they wouldn't have to go to court. So under this system, you don't have to worry not to able to afford a lawyer, because the guilty party pays everything. Okay, to continue. For that reason, the Constitution laid out the means for citizens to be protected from unreasonable search and seizures. Oh yes, because under the current drug law, the policeman needs a warrant before they bust into your house during a no-knock raid. Cruel or unusual punishments. I think life in pot would be considered a cruel or unusual punishment. Or from things like double jeopardy. Civil asset forfeiture cases, look it up, double jeopardy rules apply, because the object is considered guilty of committing. It means that while citizens have the right to defend themselves, they must also be defended if they are too weak to defend themselves. Members of the Arizona militia don't worry about home invasions, but 90-year-old grandmothers in Massachusetts might. Competitive policing and private security would be available, but public security for those who can't protect themselves is a natural right if the aim of society is to protect the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Under a private law society, if people, you could have charities that help, have people who, nonprofits, as well as for-profits. So you could have, lover of unborn children, and they represent children cases. So it's not necessarily that only under a government people are only worrying about their own litter box. Okay. To continue this case, go to reason number 2. My computer's a little slow, but I will get there in a minute. Sorry about that. I think I was thorough on the second one, though. On the first one, so rights are not guarantees. He's wrong there. Okay, number 2. An anarchist society is unable to protect its citizens from foreign invasion. Okay, a society with no collective means of defense is at the mercy of foreign powers who have not abdicated such means of survival. An anarchist state is at the mercy of anyone who wishes to expand into their territory unchecked. This is not unique to anarchy. If the United States decided to attack Switzerland, they would also be invaded. So as government has stronger weaponry and their allies have stronger weaponry, they're going to be able to defeat the weaker governments. You have world wars. Are both sides protected because they have a government? No. Germany lost World War I and II and had to pay reparations, and yet they had a military. Their military did not protect them. So simply having a military is no guarantee, to go back to his first one, that you will be protected. As long as another government has a bigger weaponry than you can still get attacked. Monaco, Switzerland, Canada, they're vulnerable from being attacked by the United States if the United States decided to attack them. So this idea that under a government, your military is able to protect you, but why are there governments who go to war and lose? So again, not true. The Constitution laid out the means through which American society can protect itself. If I band together with my neighbors to form a mutual defense pact, and we call that a constitution, it wouldn't necessarily have the same effect as a government. Again, so he's making the same fallacy as he did in the first example. I act like a government in the sense that I perform certain functions government does. They're from a government. You don't tax people to fund your services and outlaw competition. You are not a government. A mutual insurance company is not a state. Read Lysander Spooner, okay? Just because you are protecting yourself doesn't mean you're a government. Otherwise, government must by definition be good because protection is a good thing. So again, you're not being fair if you define it that way. A government is a coercive monopolization of the use of force. Just because you defend yourself doesn't mean you're a state. If government is to exist, its number one job is to protect citizens' liberties. How? A government, in order to exist, has to tax people. That is theft. I'm not protecting your liberties by taxing you, okay? As Hans Hermann Hoppe, who I'm not a big fan of, said, an expropriating property protector is a contradiction in terms. Erwin Schiff is not protected by the government. His only crime was not paying taxes. He was not a violent person. So government's job is, government in order to exist must violate your right, the right to your property, which it violates it just by being funded. And after that, to protect their lives through a reasonable national defense. Well, what's reasonable? Reasonable is very subjective. That is not overly interested on its taxpayers. Again, what does burdensome on its taxpayers mean? If you're a neocon, 30% of your taxes going to the military is not burdensome. If you're a pacifist, 1% is burdensome. So it depends on what your views are in order to determine if it's burdensome or not. What's burdensome for me is not necessarily burdensome for you. Citizens should be absolutely free to seek the means of self-defense. I agree. And should not be prohibited from exercising those means vigorously to defend their own lives, liberty, or property. They should be free to join together for mutual protection, provided they do not infringe on the fundamental natural rights of other citizens in doing so. Well, I agree completely. That's not a criticism of anarchy. Reason number 3, anarchy means that the non-aggression principle is optional. Again, government also can mean the non-aggression principle is optional. A law prohibiting drugs is not consistent with the non-aggression principle. A law prohibiting gambling is not consistent with the non-aggression principle. A law prohibiting prostitution is not consistent with the non-aggression principle. Having a government does not mean the non-aggression principle will be followed. In fact, in order to have a government, it must be broken because it taxes people and prevents other people from simply protecting themselves mutually, like he said it was okay in the second example. So anarchy is not a guarantee that the non-aggression government is no guarantee that the non-aggression principle will be followed. As the great Molinari said in his book, The Production of Liberty, anarchy is no guarantee that some steal and kidnap from others. Government is a guarantee that some will. If you believe, to continue reading, if you believe in the non-aggression principle, whose job is it to enforce it? Whoever you decide to hire. If someone breaks into your home and you are unable to defend yourself or pray for private security, who do you call? Well, what if the police are unavailable when you call them? What if the police are corrupt? Again, he makes the assumption that government is never corrupt. Government is only the protector. Assumptions. Well, okay, people have called 911 and died. There is no guarantee that the government is going to protect you. Look at North Korea. That is a government also. It doesn't protect their rights. To use an extreme example. If you have a dispute with your neighbor who you allege stole your life savings, how will you sue them or have them arrested to get it back, assuming you might be correct? Again, you agencies and a mutual third-party arbitrator that agrees to represent you. He might not want to see my defense agency. I might not want to see his defense agency. So what we do is we go to a third-party arbitrator who decides for us that we both agree to. And if one side says, I don't want to go to any arbitrator, then he has no right to complain when I use force to defend myself against him. Because what's he going to do after which he could have agreed to beforehand and then decided not to? Sorry. In an anarchist state, that's an oxymoron. No one is responsible for defending life, liberty, or property unless they are paid to do so. False. You can have non-profit defense agencies. Crimes such as theft, fraud, breach of contract, or murder could be committed against those who do not have the means of self-defense. Right. As in government, crimes are constantly done by governments, mainly for fraud, breach of contract. Government kills people. Again, he's placing the burden totally on anarchists and assuming this is the nirvana fallacy, assuming total of government. No one in Anarchistan, no one can hear you scream, and no one cares. In government, everyone can hear you scream, but no one cares. Reason number 4, principle, I didn't sign shit. The non-aggression principle is a social contract. But I didn't sign it, and neither did the enemies of liberty. The non-aggression principle is not a social contract. It is a system of justice. It is to determine what is the appropriate way for interacting with people. If you say, I don't have to follow the non-aggression principle because I never agreed to the non-aggression principle, that means other people don't have to follow the non-aggression principle. So you have no right to complain while you invite your rights and act aggressively. So it is in your self-interest to follow the non-aggression principle. Why? The city said attend people's funerals, so they attend yours. What's the reason you should follow the non-aggression principle? Not because you're signed and you're obligated to, but if you don't follow the non-aggression principle, other people are not going to follow the non-aggression principle, and they'll start on the people. So it is your self-interest to follow the non-aggression principle. It's not because you signed something that you have to follow it. It's because you have no right to complain if you violate other people's rights. A person who murders has no right to complain when he himself gets murdered. What's he going to say? You have no right to murder me? Well, then why do you say you have a right to murder people? Oh, so only you have rights and no one else does? Doesn't seem consistent to me. Anarchists often sneer at constitutionalists, arguing that they didn't sign the document, nor did they agree to it. I already explained beforehand why the non-aggression principle you don't have to abide by because you signed it. If you choose not to follow the non-aggression principle, you reap the consequences that follows from that. And they claim that the only thing we need to live is in peace and harmony is the non-aggression principle. The problem, I didn't sign it. Fine. So we will, since most people believe in non-aggression, we will band together and defend ourselves from your onslaughts. And considering that people who are non-aggressive generally have more friends and more allies than people who are bullies, it's going to be easier for the masses who are typically not aggressive and to defend themselves against a person who openly admits to not care about anyone else and is admittedly a jerk. And neither did, the only problem, I didn't sign it. And neither did King Jamil. Dead. Stalin. Dead. Hitler. Or any other statist dictator on the planet. You're right. They didn't sign the non-aggression principle, and they ended up dying at a young age. Didn't seem like it was in their rational self-interest to break it. The non-aggression principle is a social contract. No, it's not. But there is zero obligation to live by it. Well, all the people who you mentioned who didn't follow it ended up being killed because they were monsters and are universally hated throughout history. So it wasn't in the rational self-interest to do it, to follow it. Indeed, it would be dangerously naive to submit to any form of a non-aggression principle. For as soon as one party signs it, those who could not chooses to live life in a pacifistic state would be easy prey for those who do not live according to that principle. Again, it's not called the non-violence principle or the non-force principle. It's called the non-aggression initiation principle. We are not pacifists. We're not saying the non-aggression principle, go ahead, violate my rights, hurt me, and I'm not going to defend myself. No, you don't agree to follow the non-aggression principle? Fine, then I don't agree to follow the non-aggression principle, and if you attack me and my property. So, we don't fall prey to anything if we're willing to defend ourselves and have the ability to do so. We're not pacifists. That's the confusion. Also, in many cases, the non-aggression principle forbids the basic principle of preemptive strike for the purposes of self-defense. Again, if there's a threat or not. If you simply assume a person's a threat because he looks at you funny, yes, the non-aggression principle would say you can't be preemptive, but if you threaten him, you're allowed to defend yourself. And now this is where you are going to see a lot of his flaws. Anarchists argue that if there is no harm, no crime. However, if that is the case, then someone pointing a gun at you is not a crime. No, pointing a gun at you is a threat. If I point a gun at you and say, give me your money or your life, it's a threat. It doesn't matter if you pull the trigger. You are threatening to. Do you actually have to rape the woman to be punished for committing rape? No, the threat will do. In fact, if I put like a gun in my pocket and I say, give me your money, and it's just a comb, I should be still thrown in jail for stealing your wallet, even though a comb can't hurt you. So yes, threatening is harming someone because the threat is sufficient to get the job done. 4, if someone points a gun at you, it could be considered aggression. There is no harm. There is harm. You're going to risk the fact that they shoot or not. They are threatening you. They are making you nervous. They are making you scared. You're not going to want to risk your life, whether they're going to shoot at you first, and be a pacifistic victim. So there is a harm. Threats and rightly labels such acts as aggression. And so in an anarchist society. Show me anarchists who argue that if you point a gun at people, it's perfectly okay. Now, what if King Jamil placed a nuclear weapon on the launch pad aimed at Los Angeles, the equivalent of pointing a gun? Is it then moral or ethical to destroy their means of aggression? It is ethical because nuclear weapons are aggressive innately, because unlike a gun, which can pinpoint its victim precisely, a nuclear bomb is just indiscriminate mass killing. It just kills anyone within its area. It can't pinpoint and only kill a violent person. Guns can be used solely for defense. Nuclear bombs cannot. So the very use of them and the very ownership of them is per se an aggression act. Is it moral or ethical to destroy their means of aggression? Perfectly ethical. Who may be targeted ethically in such a situation? Is there any level of collateral damage in defending oneself from attack? Collateral damage is mass murder, and it's never justified. If there is collateral damage, should there be forced redistributive justice against the citizens defending themselves? People who engage in collateral damage should be forced to pay reparations against the families, victims who they killed. Yes. And to those unfairly harmed as a consequence of being in the proximity to destroy the nuclear weapons launch pad. I find it very interesting. Jan Helfeld also did this when I debated him. He's giving an example of a dictator in government doing something bad, and then show. Why doesn't he give an example of an anarchist doing something bad? Kim Jong-un is a government. Nuclear weapons were created by government. Why is he giving a scenario that exists in a statist world of the flaw of anarchy? Even the most rudimentary of scenarios, the non-aggression principle, does not provide for the means of adequate self-defense. Not in national defense or personal. I would like to see evidence, please. Number 5, private property. Who defines what is private property? Homesteading, the lordship, first come, first serve. There are many theorists who have defined what private property is. In an anarchist society, there is no actually not true. In an anarchist society, you would have different voluntary small homeowners associations or small communities, and they would have some consensus on what is considered property. Likewise, this begs the question, how do you know if government defends private property or not? The only way to know if government defends private property or if government violates private property is to have a definition of private property first. It's like saying, how do you know it's moral without government? Well, how do you know government is acting morally or immorally without a theory of morality beforehand? So if you have no way to define what private property is, you have no way to define if government is protecting it or not. So this very question begs the question which you have not answered. Some may choose to argue that intellectual property is private. You can look on my Facebook wall, that is certainly true. And I would argue that in different voluntary societies, certain societies may certain societies won't. And he gives that example right now. Some may decide otherwise and begin to acquire that property for their own benefit. Some may argue that they have a right to food and thus their neighbor's surplus should be rightly theirs, seeing how the creek from the property feeds the crops next door. Again, how do you assume that a government will be able to solve all these issues, but no other possible alternative can? Only government can solve what private properties are. No individual, no homeowners associations, no voluntary community. Only government possesses this mouse. The farmer next door might argue that the creek actually belongs to him since it flows across his fields. Again, why do you assume that whatever government says is right? Are you really going to say whatever government defines as private property is private property? So by definition, government defends private property? That is really illogical and irrational. There has to be a theory beforehand. Simply to say whatever government says is private property is no way to go about it. That decides is aggression. And if government decides everything they're doing is not aggression, by definition, they follow the non-aggression principle. That is very bad logic, though. Without a firm definition of what constitutes private property, there can be no reliable transactions between parties. Exactly. You don't need a government in order to have that. In fact, there are many theorists, and there are many communities, and there are many private property societies. Most people agree on what constitutes private property. In fact, most people who don't respect private property say they don't even acknowledge that private property exists. They'll say all property is theft. Most people who support private property agree on what private property is, and the people who disagree on what private property is typically don't support private property. An anarchist society can have truly property, but they cannot enforce it even if they all agree. Well, if they all agree, why can't they enforce it? Again, he's simply making a statement but no evidence. If everyone agrees what constitutes private property, why can't they enforce it? It's not pacifist. So again, a lot of flaws. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this video. I was inspired to make this because, I think it's important to respond to these things. And someone asked me if I could debate Austin. I'm willing to, but considering he hasn't even accepted my Facebook friend request, I think it's unlikely that he will accept a debate with me. But if people are interested, I would love to do it. Anyway, thank you, and it was great debating this article. And thanks. Take care. Bye.